I did not ask for war, but if it is brought to my doorstep, I will answer not with fear, but with fire, the fire of a people who remember what freedom costs.
Captain Ibrahim Traoré. My friends, there are moments in history when silence becomes betrayal, when the sky does not just rumble with thunder, but with warnings. At 5:42 a.m., a U.S. drone strike pierced the skies of northern Burkina Faso. It hit without notice, without consent, and without apology. Washington calls it a counter-terror operation. But ask the people of Yatenga what they saw. Ask the families burying their sons. Ask the millions who tuned in that evening, not to entertainment, but to hear their president, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, speak of sovereignty, not as a slogan, but as a right. This wasn't a strike. It was a message. One meant to intimidate, to warn, to isolate. But instead of fear, something else rose. Flags, songs, unity. If you believe that dignity is not a gift from powerful nations, but the birthright of every people, then listen closely. Because what you're about to hear will not air on the evening news. There was a time when control came in the form of chains and ships. Today it arrives in memorandums, military bases, and drones with silent wings. To understand what happened in Burkina Faso, we must look beyond that one morning. We must trace the web of power stretched across the Sahel from the deserts of Mali to the uranium fields of Niger to the gold veins beneath Ouagadougou. This is not just about a strike, it's about a pattern. For years, AFRICOM, the United States Africa Command, has operated with growing reach, often citing terrorism as the reason. Bases were built. Surveillance expanded. Joint operations became routine. But as the decades passed, many African citizens began to notice something else. The threats never seemed to disappear. The partners never seemed to leave. Burkina Faso was once under France's military umbrella. But after decades of dependency and rising insecurity, its people chose a different path. In 2023, President Ibrahim Traoré ordered the expulsion of French troops. He said, "We cannot rent out our sovereignty. We must live it." That act set a fire in the hearts of many, not just in Burkina Faso, but in Mali, Niger, Guinea. A generation raised on promises of development began to ask who benefits from all this partnership. The Sahel is rich in what the world needs: gold, rare earths, minerals for batteries and weapons. Yet its people remain some of the poorest. When foreign boots land, it is not to build schools. It is to secure corridors, contracts, and compliance. So when a U.S. drone strike kills citizens without warning, it cannot be seen in isolation. It is part of a longer history, one that smells too much like the past. Burkina Faso's leaders knew the risks of independence, but they chose it anyway. And now, as pressure mounts, one thing is becoming clear. This is not just about Burkina Faso. It's about whether Africa will be allowed to lead itself and whether the world is ready to listen. The sun had not yet risen when the sky over Yatenga province roared with sound no farmer or soldier expected. Just past 5:40 a.m., 2 guided missiles pierced the stillness of dawn and struck a rural communications outpost. The blasts shattered more than walls. They fractured the illusion that sovereignty in Africa is still respected. 3 were confirmed dead, 2 soldiers and a civilian technician. 7 more were injured. The outpost, a vital link in Burkina Faso's northern security grid, was left in ruins. Initial confusion gave way to horror when the source of the strike was identified: not militants, not rogue actors, but a U.S. drone launched from a forward base in Niger. No consultation, no warning, no explanation. This was not a joint operation. It was not requested by the Burkinabe government. And under Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, it was a direct violation of a member state's sovereignty. President Ibrahim Traoré did not wait for diplomatic spin. By nightfall, he appeared on national television, wearing his now familiar camouflage uniform, his eyes steady, his voice unwavering. This strike was not merely against our land, he said. It was against our right to exist as a free and independent people. His words echoed across radios, televisions, and smartphones. Over 8 million Burkinabe tuned in, not just to a leader, but to a line drawn in the sand. Immediately, Burkina Faso's military was placed on high alert. The Ouagadougou Air Base and Koudougou garrison escalated to DEFCON 2. Along the borders with Mali and Niger, 200 additional troops were deployed to reinforce surveillance and readiness. But the government's response wasn't just logistical, it was cultural, spiritual, emotional. By the end of the day, over 35,000 citizens gathered in Revolution Square, waving flags, singing ancestral songs of resistance. Some came to protest, others came to protect. But all came with one voice: our land, our right, our future. What began as a regional tragedy was now a national moment. Across the continent, Africa News ran continuous coverage in French and Swahili. Kenyan broadcasters hosted roundtables. Ghanaian scholars posted essays overnight. TikTok feeds flooded with solidarity videos from Lagos to Johannesburg. The questions were loud and direct. Was this strike a warning to other nations, considering a break from Western security structures? Was it meant to isolate Ibrahim Traoré, to remind him that independence has a price? In Washington, the Pentagon issued a brief statement. The strike, they claimed, had targeted a high-value extremist cell. When asked for proof, no names were offered, no coordinates, no intelligence partners cited. Back in Burkina Faso, the silence was louder than the drones. Burkinabe newspapers ran headlines reading, "Violation confirmed." Protest signs asked, "Who decides our security?" A growing consensus began to take root that this was not just an attack on a village, but a test. Would Burkina Faso flinch? Would Traoré retreat? He didn't. And in that defiance, something larger awakened. Across Bamako-Conakry, Niamey candlelight vigils emerged. In Bobo-Dioulasso, school children painted murals honoring the victims. In the diaspora from Harlem to Paris to Cape Town, activists began using a new phrase, the strike that woke Africa. Because for many, this was the moment the continent stopped reacting and started responding. What began as shock turned into something deeper, a reckoning. Within hours of the U.S. strike on Burkina Faso, the African Union convened one of its fastest emergency sessions in history. 42 foreign ministers joined a virtual summit. Many expected cautious language. Instead, they got something far more direct. If the sovereignty of one African nation can be violated without consequence, President Ibrahim Traoré declared his image towering on screens in Addis Ababa. Then none of us are safe. The silence that followed was not hesitation, it was recognition. Recognition that this was bigger than Burkina Faso. It was about the future of African self-determination. Statements poured in. Mali, Niger, and Guinea, all members of the AES alliance, issued firm condemnations. They had walked away from French tutelage. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder with their Burkinabe brothers. Algeria and South Africa, often wary of military entanglements, issued a joint call for investigation and accountability. Kenya and Ghana urged transparency from Washington. But beyond diplomacy, something else was unfolding, a shift in the streets. In Bamako, 50,000 marched, many waving Burkinabe flags beside their own. In Conakry, thousands lit candles outside the Burkinabe embassy. In Nairobi, a crowd gathered in front of the U.S. consulate, not with rage, but with resolve. One placard read, "Sovereignty is not a suggestion." The hashtags followed, "Trigger Africa is awake," "Sovereignty is not negotiable," Burkina strong. African broadcasters brought in legal scholars, historians, and former military commanders. Some framed the strike as a tactical miscalculation. Others called it a colonial reflex. But all agreed something had changed. Even diaspora communities mobilized. In Paris, New York, and Berlin, Burkinabe youth and Pan-African organizers staged demonstrations. In Harlem, A speaker told the crowd they thought they were isolating Traoré, but they united a continent. Still, Washington remained vague. A Pentagon spokesperson insisted the operation was designed to stop an imminent threat. But when pressed, the details dissolved. No confirmed targets, no visual intelligence, no collaboration with the host country. In New York, Burkina Faso's ambassador to the UN demanded an Emergency Security Council meeting. The session was intense. Russia and China condemned the strike as unlawful. France urged restraint on all sides. The United States held its position. And yet, the mood had shifted. Africa, long treated as a landscape of problems to be managed, was asserting itself as a chorus of voices to be respected. The traditional playbook, apologize, later justify, with terror move on, was unraveling. Then came the unexpected moment. Several AU member states quietly revived a long-dormant idea, the formation of a joint African defense pact. A rapid response force, not beholden to foreign partners, but built by African nations for African defense. This wasn't just theoretical. Defense ministers from Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso began exploratory talks. The term Sahel Shield entered the regional vocabulary. What happened to Burkina Faso today, said one Nigerian analyst on national television, could happen to us tomorrow. Unity is no longer idealism. It's survival. Meanwhile, alternative alliances began to form. Brazil's foreign ministry issued a rare statement of concern, warning that precedent matters more than power. Malaysia echoed similar sentiments. In Ankara and Moscow, media coverage painted Ibrahim Traoré as a new face of global resistance, not a threat, but a challenge to unipolar dominance. Perhaps the clearest sign of change came not from diplomats or generals, but from African citizens themselves. Call-in radio shows buzzed across the continent. Farmers in Senegal, traders in Benin, students in South Africa. They weren't debating what the US meant. They were asking, what does Africa want? For too long, diplomacy had been shaped by distance. Now, proximity to power, to pain, to potential, was reshaping the conversation. And through it all, one figure stood at the center. Not because he wanted to, but because he refused to bow. Some moments do not fade with the news cycle. They echo. They root themselves in the collective memory and begin to grow. The morning after the US drone strike on Burkina Faso, the shock had not worn off, but something else had begun recalibration. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't wait for international permission to act. Within 72 hours, his administration announced a full audit of all military agreements with Western nations. Every document was to be reviewed for violations of sovereignty and mutual respect. A message was sent, not just to Washington, but to every capital where African independence is still treated as conditional. But it was more than talk. The Sahel Shield Alliance was born in Bamako, a formal mutual defense pact between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. For the first time in modern African history, three nations under military leadership declared they would respond collectively if any one of them was attacked without consent. The declaration was simple, clear, and unmistakable. The era of unilateral foreign strikes in Africa is over. Across Africa, this wasn't viewed as provocation. It was self-respect. A long-delayed refusal to be targeted without recourse. Burkina Faso's pivot continued beyond the military sphere. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs began active talks with governments in Algeria, Iran, Brazil, and Malaysia, seeking trade routes, infrastructure partnerships, and agricultural exchanges outside traditional Western channels. Economically, the transition was not painless. Fuel imports from coastal neighbors slowed as border traffic tightened under new security protocols. The price of diesel spiked by 12% in 2 weeks. In northern provinces, grain costs rose by nearly 10%. There were murmurs of concern, especially from working-class families. But when asked in public polling whether these costs were worth the price of sovereignty, 78% said yes. Better to walk free and hungry? said one shopkeeper in Wahiguya. Then to kneel with a full stomach, the sentiment spread. In Mali, similar conversations erupted. Should Western bases remain? Should foreign NGOs dictate internal policies? In Niger, students held forums on economic independence. In Senegal and Togo, newspapers ran editorials titled, "Burkina Faso is not alone." Inside Burkina Faso, civil society didn't sit idle either. Youth groups organized town halls. Teachers held classroom debates on sovereignty and justice. Artists painted murals of Traoré holding a flaming map, not of war, but of awakening. Still, it wasn't blind allegiance. Intellectuals, lawyers, and opposition members demanded transparency. "We support the president's stand," said one Ouagadougou attorney, "but we must also protect our truth." Sovereignty without accountability is just another kind of control. Traoré, to his credit, allowed these voices to speak. State media gave airtime to critics. Ministers held Q&A sessions with student leaders. The government wasn't just building military alliances. It was trying slowly to build a culture of sovereignty where dissent was not seen as disloyalty, but as a necessary ingredient for lasting freedom. Internationally, the strike had triggered introspection in unexpected places. In Washington, members of the U.S. Senate requested a closed-door Pentagon briefing. Several lawmakers, including from the Foreign Relations Committee, raised alarms. "If we are launching military strikes in sovereign nations without consent," said Senator Rutledge from Illinois, "then we are inviting consequences not just abroad, but at home." France, still stinging from its own loss of influence in the Sahel, chose a cautious path silence, but Germany and Italy voiced unease. Berlin issued a quiet warning. Partnership cannot survive without trust. Russia and China, seizing the moment, increased diplomatic overtures toward the Sahel, offering security aid and infrastructure deals. While some in the West called it opportunism, others saw it differently, a realignment not of ideology, but of agency. Burkina Faso was not shifting allegiance. It was choosing autonomy. The missiles had fallen, but so had the mask, the one that said Africa must always listen, but never lead. And across the continent, a simple phrase gained strength. We do not ask permission to be free. In international affairs, there are events, and then there are turning points. The U.S. drone strike on Burkina Faso was not merely a violation of borders. It was a strategic miscalculation, not because it missed a target, but because it misunderstood the moment. For decades, the West viewed the Sahel as a canvas for counterterrorism operations, resource extraction, and influence. Fragile governments were offered aid packages and joint trainings. In return, silence was expected. But that equation was built on a false premise that African leaders and their people would forever trade sovereignty for security. President Ibrahim Traoré proved otherwise. His government's response was not rash. There was no immediate retaliation, no reckless provocation. Instead, Traoré played a different game, one rooted in diplomacy, symbolism, and long-term positioning. Within days, Burkina Faso began renegotiating military agreements. Conditions were introduced: mutual consent, African command leadership, and the right to cancel operations without foreign veto. This was not isolationism. It was realignment. And the impact rippled far beyond Ouagadougou. In Niamey, Niger's interim president ordered a review of all U.S. and French troop activities. In Bamako, Mali's leadership initiated talks with regional defense experts on local arms production and intelligence sharing. In Guinea and Chad, the language of African-led security appeared for the first time in official policy papers. This wasn't just political theater. It was a geostrategic correction decades in the making. And for the United States, it presented a serious dilemma. Since 9/11, the Pentagon has invested billions in African operations, drone hubs in Niger, naval facilities in Djibouti, training programs across West Africa. These assets were meant to create a friendly footprint. But with one unauthorized strike, much of that goodwill evaporated. The justification and imminent extremist threat lacked detail. And African nations noticed. They remembered other interventions: Libya, Somalia, even the economic weapons of the IMF and World Bank. The message from Washington may have been safety, but it was heard in Africa as control. What the West failed to grasp is that Africa's calculus has changed. Today's leaders, from Traoré to Assimi Goïta in Mali to Mohamed Déby in Chad, are not bound by Cold War logic. They're not asking who to align with, but how to operate without dependency. And the youth they're watching closely. More than 60% of Africa's population is under 25. This generation was raised not under colonization, but under globalization. They've seen the internet. They've seen resource-rich nations remain poor. They've seen leaders punished for independence and praised for submission. And now they've seen a president who stood firm and wasn't crushed. The U.S. strike was supposed to intimidate. Instead, it inspired. The Sahel Shield Alliance, now formalized, is not just a military pact. It's a statement of intent. Africa will no longer tolerate unilateral military action on its soil. And that statement is gaining traction. Algeria and South Africa are exploring regional defense platforms. Kenya is reevaluating foreign training programs. Even nations with traditionally strong U.S. ties like Ghana are demanding clearer terms in military contracts. This is the map redrawing itself, not with war, but with will. And in this redrawing, new players are entering. China, Russia, Turkey, Iran, they're all offering partnerships framed not as charity, but as equity. Infrastructure for minerals, military equipment for access, technical aid for diplomatic space. This isn't a perfect solution. These nations bring their own ambitions. But the difference is that African leaders are now setting the terms. For the West, this is unfamiliar terrain. The unipolar moment where one power dictated global terms is over. Multipolarity has arrived. And Africa, long seen as a chessboard, is now becoming a player. The drone strike in Burkina Faso was supposed to be surgical. But geopolitics is not surgery. It's chemistry. And the elements are reacting. In Washington, analysts now speak of a Sahel vacuum, a space where Western influence is receding. But perhaps it's not a vacuum. Perhaps it's simply space being reclaimed by those it belongs to. For Traoré, this moment is not just about survival. It's about modeling a different kind of leadership, one that neither begs nor antagonizes, but asserts. His message is not anti-Western. It's anti-violation. We do not reject friendship, he said at a recent AU summit, but friendship cannot be built with missiles. What happens next? That depends not on foreign capitals, but on African unity, discipline, and clarity. The old alliances are crumbling. The new ones are being shaped in real time in Bamako, in Niamey, in Addis Ababa, in the minds of millions asking a simple question: what does freedom actually look like? If Burkina Faso is any indication, the answer is no longer abstract. It's policy, it's posture, and it's here. If you ever marched in Selma, if you ever questioned Vietnam, if you remember Watergate or whispered the name COINTELPRO, then you know power unchecked does not stop itself. And now a question stands before you, not as a spectator, but as a witness. Because what happened in Burkina Faso was not a glitch in the system. It is the system. A global order where might still tries to silence memory and missiles arrive before explanations. But this time, something shifted. A young African leader, Ibrahim Traoré, stood before the world and said, "We do not ask permission to be free." And his people, miners, mothers, farmers, students, stood with him, not with rage, but with resolve, not with weapons, but with will. This was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something long overdue. A continent speaking in its own voice, writing its own future, defending its own sky. So what do you do if you believe in sovereignty, not as rhetoric, but as a human right? If you believe Africa is not a place to be managed, but a people to be respected, then don't just scroll past this story. Share it. Don't just admire resistance. Stand with it, because the missiles may have fallen in Burkina Faso, but the silence that falls everywhere else, and history is listening.